This is Part 2, Episode 81. The three judges swiftly made their assessments on the competition stage, and they affirmed that Hui Yuhao had successfully created a soul tool. However, the judges shared the third elder and the vice sect leader's confusion, and they didn't understand why Hui Yuhao would craft a soul tool like that. This was a defensive soul tool in a fight, which meant that Hui Yuhao would be the passive one taking hits. Did he want to defeat his component by grinding down his soul power? 98 didn't look so good when he saw that Hui Yuhao's soul tool was a shield. Initially, he had believed that Hui Yuhao was creating an offensive soul tool with incredible attacking strength. But it seemed like his judgment was wrong, and that meant some of his plans to counter Hui Yuhao were wasted. He had spent 4 hours creating an invincible barrier against Hui Yuhao specifically because of his erroneous judgment. All 6 soul engineers were quickly validated. 98 had 6 completed soul tools, Hui Yuhao had only 1, and 96 also had 6. Hikaitu had 5, and the remaining 2 had 4 each. 96 and 98 had a great advantage over the others in terms of the number of soul tools they had created. The chief judge took the speaker-type soul tool from a Jin. He announced the number of soul tools that each contestant had finished before he lowered his voice and said, "I'll pose my routine questions now. The crafting phase is over, and because this is the round of 6, every soul tool will have to be field-tested, no matter how each one has turned out. Your soul tools have to be proven in battle to show their strengths and their worth. Let me ask you now, does anyone feel that your soul tools are not enough to fight against your opponent? You have the option to back out now. Otherwise, you are responsible for your own injuries, and even your death once we enter the combat phase." There was a lot more tension on the competition stage once this was said, and the atmosphere felt a lot more antagonistic. Many officials were already on stage to remove the 6 crafting desks, and they also temporarily removed the rare metals that were intended as prizes. It was clear that this circular competition stage was where the 6 soul engineers would fight it out. Very well. Since nobody has decided to back out, we shall commence the combat phase. May I invite 96 and 37 to start the first match. Hui Yuhao's individual bet with 98, along with the incredible value of their stakes, meant that they would probably be the last to fight. The first match would definitely be between the more unbalanced pairs. 37 fought against 96, and was already at a complete disadvantage in his aura and disposition. There was no suspense at all, and 96 took just 5 minutes to achieve an overwhelming victory. Then it was Hikaitu's turn against 85. Hikaitu gradually stepped towards the competition stage with a large cannon on his shoulders. He had crafted 5 soul tools: the black heavy cannon on his shoulder, a round breastplate, a shield, a waistplate, and a helmet. Those were his 5 different soul tools, and he was well equipped in terms of both attack and defense. Almost every single contestant chose this direction. Hikaitu's opponent was a little simpler in comparison. His opponent had a breastplate, and 1 relatively smaller soul cannon on each of his shoulders. He also had a belt-like soul tool around his waist. They were inside the Golden Hall's competition stage after all, and it was a lot smaller than the Continental Elite Youth Soul Master Tournament's competition stage. Neither party had much space to move around, and any long-range attacks could reach the other side in no time. The 3 judges returned to their positions, and the chief judge exclaimed, "Begin." Both Hikaitu and 85 unleashed their martial souls at almost the same time. Hikaitu was very quick, and 6 soul rings rose up from his feet. On seeing this, the audience erupted into shouts and exclamations. Hikaitu was a 6-ringed soul emperor, and this meant that this tall and broad-shouldered man in a mask was likely to be a Class 6 soul engineer as well. The people who had placed their bets on Hikaitu began to gasp and exclaim in joy and delight. 85 paled in comparison. He had 2 yellow and 3 purple soul rings, only 5 soul rings, and he didn't have the most optimal soul ring combination. Both parties chose to unleash the same soul tool initially, a protective soul barrier. A layer of white light rose up and enveloped their bodies inside. Both soul barriers were Class 5, as they had only had 10 hours to craft their soul tools. The belt-like soul tool that 85 had around his waist burst with colorful light, and circle after circle of intense light rippled out from it. His soul power undulations began to flourish with lightning speed. The soul cannon on his left shoulder was a brilliant white soul ray. The air around it felt a little strange as this ray surged out, and everyone seemed to see cracks and tears in the air wherever this soul ray passed. The air seemed to become glassy and shatter in its wake. The other soul cannon fired a pink sphere of light. This sphere was as big as a fist, but it grew increasingly larger as it flew through the air. Every single contestant who could make it into the round of 6 had their own unique strengths, and 85 wasn't an exception. Even Hui Yuhao was a little astonished as he watched those soul cannons. Both of them were Class 5 soul tools that were rarely seen. The soul ray that cracked open the air as it flew was called a splitting shockwave. Even though it was similar to a shock bomb, there was a world of difference between them. Shock bombs relied on intense and forceful shockwaves and undulations, but the splitting shockwave resembled uncountable knives and blades. Powerful cutting effects would be dished out to the target, and it would cut in very irregular patterns. The splitting shockwave was highly destructive, fierce, and brutal. However, it was very difficult to craft one of these, and it was quite challenging to control it as well. Splitting shockwaves were inherently unstable, and could easily injure their user. Therefore, soul engineers typically didn't opt for such a soul tool. However, 85 seemed very confident, and it was clear that he was very familiar with using similar soul tools. The pink sphere on the other side wasn't much worse, and it was known as an enfeebling cannon. This cannon could be considered a more primitive version of the aging ray, which had been used on Wang Chua. It was difficult for any energy-based defenses to dispel an enfeebling cannon's effects, and anybody struck by it would immediately enter a weakened state. This weakened state was a prolonged and continuous one, and the victim would have to rest for a very long time to recover. Both soul tools were considered incredibly difficult to craft among Class 5 soul tools. Furthermore, a lot of soul power had to be consumed when using them. It was clear that 85 was prepared with his equipment. He had a Class 5 protective soul barrier to defend himself, and his energy-gathering belt boosted his soul power, while his 2 formidable soul cannons would take care of his opponent. His setup was quite impressive. The splitting shockwave was the first to reach Hikai-2. It clashed with Hikai-2's soul barrier, shrill and ear-piercing sounds ringing out. The audience could see cuts and scars swiftly webbing out across Hikai-2's soul barrier. The splitting shockwave's most frightening characteristic was that it could be fired continuously. As long as the user had enough soul power to sustain his or her attack, this attack could be used continuously and without pause. Of course, this attacking style increased the chances of the soul tool itself breaking apart. The enfeebling cannon shell followed immediately afterwards. It was not hard to imagine that Hikai-2's soul barrier would definitely not be able to withstand the splitting shockwaves if he entered a weakened state, and it was likely that that would be instantly sliced and diced into pieces. 85 immediately took the upper hand as he made his first attack. But Hikai-2 wasn't worried or panicky from beginning to end. He pressed his shield and its orange light, and the orange radiance seemed to materialize as it wrapped around his protective soul barrier and barricaded the splitting shockwave without. The cracks and scars immediately vanished. Hikai-2's feet moved as the enfeebling cannon shell came shortly after. He took a step to the left, evading the attack with incredible speed. The fact that his large and bulky body could make such agile and nimble dodging movements was astonishing. The enfeebling cannon charge was locked onto him, however, and began to follow him as he waltzed around. The helmet on Hikai-2's head lit up, a bright silver beam erupting out of it and circling once around his body. The enfeebling cannon charge was pursuing closely behind him, so it was naturally encompassed within this beam's radius, and was instantly scooped up by the silver light. Right at that moment, a brilliant blue pillar of light surged across the competition stage. This blue pillar boomed like a thunderbolt, and the entire golden hall seemed to tremble and shiver along with it. There was only a protective dome around the competition stage. There wasn't a soundproofing barrier. Therefore, everybody in the audience could hear the crisp and deafening boom. The heavy cannon on Hikai-2's shoulder was finally unleashed, a lightning cannon. This was one of Hikai-2's favorite soul tools. Frightening lightning tore the air open as it thundered towards Hikai-2's opponent. The bluish-purple lighting caused the air to twist and contort, and 85 had just evaded his own enfeebling cannon charge when his face changed. Class 6. That's a Class 6 lightning cannon. My protective soul barrier can't handle that. He hesitated for a single moment before he shouted, I admit defeat. He did have an option against this attack. He could use his invincible barrier to defend himself, but doing so was no different from admitting defeat. Almost every soul engineer above Class 5 was equipped with an invincible barrier, but this item was so outrageously expensive that nobody would ever use it unless the circumstance was a matter of life and death. This was especially so when the tournament prohibited using soul tools that were not crafted during the tournament, and this meant using an invincible barrier was equivalent to admitting defeat. Boom. The lightning cannon was withdrawn after just one shot. But even so, 85 was immediately thrown backwards from the impact, and his Class 5 protective soul barrier instantly shattered. His soul power was almost entirely smashed away by the impact, and his entire body was burned black. He puked out a mouthful of blood when he dropped back to the ground. A Jinn couldn't help but exclaim, 85 loves wealth more than he loves his life. I believe he has an invincible barrier with him, but he couldn't bear to use it. I would have done the same thing if I had been in his shoes. It's a pity I'm not a soul engineer. The battle was over, and victory had been determined. Hikaitu was actually quite merciful and generous. Otherwise, if he had unleashed his lightning cannon's strength to its fullest extent, 85 would have been heavily injured, or instantly killed. Thank you for showing me mercy. 85 climbed to his feet, and immediately bowed respectfully to Hikaitu. Even though he had lost this round, his opponent had instantly stopped attacking after he admitted defeat. He was full of goodwill towards his opponent. Hikaitu remembered everything that Hui Yuhao had told him. He didn't make a sound, but nodded in his opponent's direction before he departed the competition stage to claim his prize. 2 matches out of 3 were over. 96 was very powerful and dominant, and Hikaitu's last Class 6 soul tool was equally strong and impressive. Both of them gave the audience a deep and lasting impression. Soul engineers typically resolved their combats very quickly, and rifts in strength and standards were quickly presented in a fight. The highlight of the show was about to begin, and the contestants that had bet against one another were about to fight. Everyone in the audience began to take shorter and quicker breaths. Some were pleased and others upset about the result of the previous 2 matches, but the third and final match had the best odds. This was especially true for those who had placed their bets on Hui Yuhao. Every single one of them could feel butterflies in their stomach. Even though they knew their chances of winning their bets were slim, they still had to hold on to that thread of hope until the very end. The odds were 1 to 3, these was considered very good odds, and they would make windfall profits if they won this bet. Those who had placed their bets on 98 weren't worried at all. 6 soul tools versus 1, unless his opponent had a trump card that ensured his victory, 98's advantage was just too evident. There was nothing they had to be worried about at all. Hui Yuhao smiled, but his smile felt a little chilly. Officials pushed his wheelchair onto the competition stage, and 98 stepped onto the stage on the other side, fully equipped with his 6 soul tools. Their gazes met, and the corner of 98's mouth curled into a smile. Do you feel the pressure now, little fellow? Give it up. I won't kill you, considering you've given me such a nice present. I'll let you keep your life because of that. Hui Yuhao's face was black. We haven't even fought yet. How are you so sure that you'll win? Let me tell you, I have a lot of soul power. HMPH. 98 laughed heartily and said, that means you want to use that shield of yours to grind me down until I have no soul power left. Do you think that's realistic? I have at least 100 ways of breaking through your defenses. You're so outrageous and arrogant even though you're sitting on that wheelchair. Now I understand why you are crippled. Hui Yuhao felt a knot form in his heart. Even though he was intentionally showing weakness to his opponent, he still didn't feel very happy when his opponent labeled him as an outrageous and arrogant cripple. All 3 judges turned towards him confusedly. Hui Yuhao said, I've already given my stake to you before this. The crafting phase is over, so shouldn't 98 give his stake to you just like I have? That's only fair. 98 felt his face freeze for a moment, but he quickly returned to normal. He generously revealed the darkness green dragon in his hands and said, take it away, then. It will come back to me in a moment's time, anyway. Hui Yuhao could clearly tell that 98 couldn't bear to part with his carving knife when the judges took it away. All soul engineers at every class were as intimate with the carving knife they always used as if it were their own child. It was natural that any soul engineer would feel a little out of place without their favorite carving knife in their possession. They entered the competition stage and took their sides. They had the soul tools that they had crafted earlier on them. Hui Yuhao placed his shield flat down on his legs and gently caressed its surface. The unsettled expression on his face gradually disappeared, and he finally displayed a self-confident smile. He was absolutely certain that this shield was one of the most successful soul tools that he had crafted over his entire life, and had named it the Adjudication Shield. Are you guys ready? The judges inquired from their elevated seats. I'm ready. Both Hu Yuhao and 98 responded at the same time. All right. Bring up the protective barriers. The pale yellow protective barriers rose up and formed a hemisphere that encompassed the entire competition stage. The barriers were there to prevent the soul tools unleashed from damaging the Golden Hall. Hu Yuhao raised the shield in his hands. 98 seemed as casual as ever on the other side, and he raised a strange-looking soul cannon with his right hand. Begin. The round of 6 final match began with the judge's announcement. Hu Yuhao raised his shield in front of him. However, not a single soul ring could be seen on his body. On the other side, whistling sounds could be heard beneath 98's feet as 2 yellow, 2 purple, and 2 black soul rings rose up, one after another. Dense soul power undulations immediately rippled from his body. He wasn't at all hasty to attack. Instead, he took a few steps forward as he placed his soul cannon on his shoulder. Of the other 6 soul tools that he had created, other than his invincible barrier, he took the longest to craft this one. This soul cannon looked like it was embedded into his shoulder, and it gave the audience the feeling that it was part of his body. This was a quality that an outstanding soul engineer had to possess, and every soul tool he created had to have chemistry with the soul engineer's body. This soul cannon was silver-white in color, and faintly radiated green light. The cannon's mouth was flat and rectangular, and the entire cannon seemed a little peculiar. The black, flat opening began to flicker with light. Inside the central guest lounge, the third elder muttered under his breath, "I want to see how this fellow is going to defend himself against Mo Ku's corrosive decomposition cannon." With the darkness green dragon's amplifications, this corrosive decomposition cannon would be considered very powerful even among Class 6 soul tools. It's very explosive, but its continuous destructiveness is its strongest attribute. No matter what deflective and absorptive effects that shield possesses, it can only take effect on material entities. How is he going to defend himself? Hu Yuhao proved how he could defend himself on the competition stage. He placed his shield in front of him, and began to chant something under his breath. The shield blocked everyone's vision, and his eyes suddenly turned gray. The audience watched as the corrosive decomposition beam was about to reach his shield. A gray streak suddenly burst from Hu Yuhao's body, and condensed into a sphere of smoky fog that blocked the beam's forward movement, just like that. A series of crackling sounds could be heard as steam rose up from the competition stage. Hu Yuhao didn't move at all, but a black skeleton suddenly appeared before him. This skeleton seemed to have been called from nowhere, and the grey fog blocked the light beam for one moment before this black skeleton forcefully intervened. The skeleton quickly turned dark green. Right after that, it emitted an aching, clattering sound that made it seem as if it could collapse at any time. As Hu Yuhao continued chanting, streams of grey air continued to surge from his body, flowing into the black skeleton in front of him. Upon absorbing these streams of air, the skeleton began to totter about. However, it only continued to totter and not collapse. Everyone couldn't help but feel astonished upon witnessing this scene. Was 66 not planning on using his soul tool to take 98's attack? Wasn't he clearly using the power of his martial soul? Was his martial soul a skeleton? Furthermore, was he summoning a skeleton outside his body? However, why did none of his soul rings light up upon strengthening that skeleton's defenses? While everyone else was dumbstruck, Hu Yuhao himself was somewhat astonished. As he used the necromantic arts his teacher had imparted to him, he felt that it was somewhat incompatible with his spirit eyes. His spiritual power was relatively strong right now. The moment he felt something was off, he immediately withdrew his spirit eyes along with its soul rings. Moreover, he suddenly felt as if something in his mind had shattered. Right after that, he felt a trace of enlightenment, along with a large amount of information that filled his spiritual sea. The sudden appearance of so many astonishing things in one's mind would definitely have struck any other person dumb. However, Hu Yuhao was a person who had cultivated his spiritual power to the concrete material realm. After a brief moment of astonishment, he immediately used his spiritual power to temporarily seal these pieces of memory-like information in his spiritual sea. At the same time, he continued chanting his spell. A strange scene stunned the entire audience. Under the eyes of everyone present, a grey soul ring quietly rose from Hu Yuhao's feet. Right, a grey soul ring that was filled with a deathly stillness. The instant it appeared, it seemed as if all of the light within the Golden Hall had vanished. A tall, faint figure appeared behind Hu Yuhao's back. Although it was only a silhouette, and its facial features couldn't be clearly seen, the boundless aura coming from it stunned the entire field. Practically everyone seated in the center of the VIP lounge got to their feet at the same time, their expressions that of bewilderment. Even the female vice-founder wasn't an exception to this. All of them quickly moved to the window, staring at Hu Yuhao. Hu Yuhao felt his senses immediately change the instant the grey soul ring appeared. The various spells of the divine law of necromancy that Calamity Necromancer, Electrolux, had imparted to him in the past began to appear clearly in his mind. Every single spell appeared like a construct or model, and the originally superfluous spells seemed to shorten. Now, he would be able to cast any of his spells as long as he followed the models within his mind. Hu Yuhao raised the shield with his right hand. Due to the brief pause he had, the black skeleton in front of him had already exploded with a bang and turned into small fragments, because of the corrosive decomposition cannon. The cannon charge then landed on his adjudication shield at practically the same instant. Unexpectedly, Hu Yuhao put his shield away and placed it on his legs. At this moment, 98 finally saw the deathly grey in his eyes. That large door seemed as thin as a feather, but the corrosive decomposition stopped moving after falling into it, as though it had fallen in quicksand. Right after that, a mournful howl rang out from that door. With a wave of his hand, the door that had already fallen to the ground several meters away from him instantly stood upright. A grey figure pounced out from the door, charging straight towards 98. This was a metallic green humanoid with a pair of wings on its back. However, it didn't have a head. This sudden change of events left 98 greatly astonished, yet somewhat frenetic. He paused the firing of his corrosive decomposition cannon for a brief moment, then aimed it at that zombie. An ear-piercing shriek mixed with the poison mist caused by the corrosion in the air rang out. However, the headless zombie only paused for a brief moment when facing 98's attack. Right after that, it charged forward, ignoring the destructive might of the corrosive decomposition cannon. His body was tougher than cast iron. This necromantic spell was called the Spectral Gate, and its activation would create a door linked to the netherworld, summoning a spectre that could aid one in combat. According to the memories that Electrolux had left him, the Spectral Gate could summon a spectre whose strength could range from a 3-ringed to a 6-ringed Orthodox Soul Master from the Dolua continent. The specific spectre that would be summoned, on the other hand, would be dependent on one's luck. The fact that the headless iron zombie was able to directly take on a corrosive decomposition cannon truly astonished Hu Yuhao. However, he didn't dare to dally around. He quickly released another necromantic spell. A transparent grey whip appeared before Hu Yuhao. With a wave, it struck the headless iron zombie. Immediately, the headless zombie let out a mournful shriek. A ray of light, that was identical to it in texture, was drawn out from its body, before merging back into it. This was the Death Whip, a weapon which could directly attack an opponent's soul. If it was used on one's own summoned spectres, it would raise its combat strength for a brief period of time. After being struck by the Death Whip, a bronze tint appeared on the headless zombie's skin. It forcefully took another cannon shot, getting within 5 meters of 98. Currently, 98 was truly feeling somewhat panicked. Smacking his chest with his right hand, he instantly released a white soul ring that tossed the rushing headless zombie away. Nobody would have thought that the Elite Soul Engineering Tournament would end up like this, but nobody could say that Hu Yuhao was breaking the rules, either. After all, the round of 6 permitted the use of Soul Master abilities. Only, Hu Yuhao's abilities were overly strange. These were clearly the skills of an evil Soul Master. If this wasn't an underground tournament, some of the orthodox soul engineers there would have called him into question. However, this was the Duskwater Alliance, and nothing could stop the betting from continuing. Hu Yuhao seldom used necromantic magic, but it helped conceal his identity within the Golden Hall. At this moment, the skill with which he used these magics began to improve. The headless zombie immediately charged forward again, after being pushed back. While it took care of 98, Hu Yuhao began to chant another spell. A red ring of light quietly appeared beneath 98, rising into the air. Right after that, a dark red skull appeared above him, and his movements seemed to slow somewhat. This was the Curse of Blood, a necromantic spell that could slow a person down. This spell had another terrifying bit to it. Once its target was attacked, the effect of the curse would flare up, injuring him even more. After casting this spell, Hu Yuhao's chanting became even more resounding. As his strange chants continued to ring out, the illusory figure of light behind him became even clearer. One could faintly see that this figure was precisely the divine law of necromancy, Calamity Necromancer Electrolux. Naturally, only Hu Yuhao was able to identify him. Everyone else could only see the blurry image of an old man. The strength of a necromantic spell was normally proportional to the length of its chant. The longer the chant, the stronger the spell would be. Part 2 end here.